Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about KZ's new all-balanced armature set. This one is Sonata. So it does come in new fancy full-color packaging. This is the outer box. The inner box does have the blue case, which I think they've actually used before. You do get the SPC and blue style cable. It is a high-strand QDC style cable. It is very nice. It's been around for quite a while. KZ tends to include it on the special sets, and they've included it with Sonata. You do get a tip card in this one as well, which has a full set of foams and a full set of the star lines, which is actually pretty cool. I'm not sure they've actually used a tip card. Maybe they've used it once before, but it's nice to get a full style, and I've actually used both of them, and that's why the larges are kind of sitting there at the bottom of the, because I was using those at some point in time. And the shells, and I'll say that the foam tips are handy because of this style shell. It is a large style shell. I call it KZ's large format shell. For those of you with smaller ears and you might experience more pressure buildup, do check out the foam tips. That will kind of get you around that problem. But otherwise, even for small ears without a pressure problem, these are large format shells. And I think going forward into 2025, I would say that would be one of my wishes for KZ is to slim down this style shell just a little bit. I mean, it ends up being quite large. And yeah, of course, there's 14 balanced armatures sitting in there, and that is going to take up a lot of room. But yeah, I think that is one of the main criticisms on these style shells and on KZ's all balanced armatures or even hydro. The shells tend to be a little bit large for smaller ears, so I do think that would be one of those great things going forward is to kind of address that. So we'll kind of take a look at it and we'll kind of jump into it, look at a couple graphs, we'll jump into it. And I guess even before we begin, I would say that KZ Sonata is kind of expensive. It is, I think all of the AS24s or even some of the BA series have actually been quite expensive. They're always kind of hovering around the $100 price range. I know in the past KZ has done some cheaper balanced armature sets, but at least the AS24 sets have actually been up there. So this one jumped up in price, and yeah, I think it is kind of pushing the price boundary. But one thing I tend to mention on their all BA sets is that KZ does use the full balanced armature base drivers, and that's something that it's just harder to find. Even at $150, you don't see that all that often. If you see all balanced armature sets in the lower price points, they tend to be using two full range drivers, and maybe they'll have a crossover. So one balanced armature is doing the base and one is doing the upper. But having a implementation of a full BA base driver is something that doesn't really happen at the $100 price point. Mainly from KZ is where you see that. So it is something a little bit unique to KZ's BA series, and I think it is actually cool and it's something to point out. And those of you who are curious what the more expensive all BA sets that have dedicated balanced armature base drivers are going to sound like, they kind of sound, the base sounds a little bit more similar to KZ's implementation because they do have the full-size base driver. So little cool tidbit on these guys, and it's something that I've mentioned probably on AS24 and AS24 Pro as well, and it carries through onto Sonata. So if you were curious about AS24 or AS24 Pro, how they compare to Sonata, both of them are more V-shaped than Sonata. So AS24 is kind of right there in the blue. AS24 Pro was just a little bit below AS24. So you can kind of see the series went from AS24 kind of way up there. Pro is going to be a little bit flatter on the V-shape, and then Sonata is an even flatter V-shape. And it's kind of hard to see here on the graph because it's a little bit smaller, but this base level is quite neutral, and even the treble level, where AS24 was above the Harman target, this one is kind of well below the Harman target, and especially as you get out into the mid-treble and upper treble, those levels are actually quite below the Harman target. So this one, I would call it mid-centric. It is definitely a flat style V or a neutral style. It's not really a V anymore because there isn't really any boost to it, and the way it sounds is more mid-centric, where the mids are forward and the bass and the treble are essentially tucked underneath the mids, and it definitely comes across more of mid-centric. But similar to AS24, I think in shape, but definitely a much flatter V. There's definitely more mids on Sonata. And it's definitely a further refinement to lose the BA timbre and increase coherence, where KZ typically loses it, leaving the treble a little bit too high, a little bit too hot. And as I said, from AS24 to AS24 Pro down to Sonata, they've kind of continuously brought down this level. And the level may look a little bit, especially AS24 or AS or Sonata, will look a little bit more similar to a set like Jazir's Butterfly 61T in the treble. So, those sets, I think, actually have that goal of losing the BA timbre and increasing coherence, and they tend to use this kind of sharper roll-off in the treble, and that's exactly kind of what KZ adopted here. So Butterfly and the others, the other Meyer sets, I think are actually quite good at reducing BA timbre, increasing coherence, and they do that with some bassy warmth. So they bring this down on a nice steep curve. They don't really rise high in the pinna area, keep the fatigue and the shout down really low, kind of cut across and then drop off, so you don't get some of those coherence and BA timbre problems from too much upper treble. Exactly what KZ does on Sonata as well. But I would say that Butterfly tends to do this move. So you end up with a warmer, bassier style sound to it because they have a really kind of a steeper tilt to the bass curve. KZ took a different path and they did a more neutral style bass. And again, this bass curve is going to tuck right underneath the mids. You're going to have a more mid-centric sound as opposed to a bassy warm sound. So KZ's version of this style graph, it tries to do something similar, right? You basically arc down the treble and keep these levels low, so there is no fatigue, there is no sibilance, there isn't as much BA timbre as you're going to get from some of the that were present in some of the past KZ sets, but do it with cleaner mids. Now you have this really lower, more neutral style bass shelf that isn't going to impart really much, there isn't going to be really any warmth or any bass bleeding into the mids with such a low style bass shelf. You end up with a more open, more resolving sound using this style bass shelf. And that's not, and Jazir and Butterfly, they essentially go for a different style sound, that warmer, smoother, bassier sound, and that's fine. That's one style to do it, and KZ just kind of took a different path and a different style tuning. But treble wise, I think they both had a very similar goal in really reducing the BA timbre that you can get from higher BA count BA sets, and also having the coherence. So they did it with a little bit more warmth, and KZ just did it by making everything a little bit more neutral. So is this one better than Hydro? And I will say it's very different than Hydro. Hydro is actually a very V-shaped set, very different. But if you want a more mid-centric set, Sonata is going to be closer to what you were looking for. Hydro is definitely even more of a Butterfly style set. It's more of a bigger V style set. So I would just call them very different. You can't really listen to one or the other one and say, well, this one is better than the other one. They are simply two different styles, and two different people are going to like either one of them, but the same person may not like both of them, because if you like V-shaped sets, then this set isn't going to make a whole lot of sense to you. So the bass, when we look at this bass curve, and there are switches which will actually move this bass curve basically from flat at 60, and this is the 100, which is right here, and then there's a higher, a 1100 will actually move it slightly up. But if you are a fan of a set like AS24 or even AS24 Pro, you are a fan of KZ's bigger BA bass style sound, you're probably not going to be happy. This one is definitely more mid-centric. It definitely has a flatter bass curve. It needs to be, this one being a mid-centric set, that bass shelf really needed to be under the mids. It really has to support the mids and provide full style mids versus a big bass V-shaped sound. This one was really meant to not have a boosted bass sound, and that's exactly what they deliver. That is different than AS24. It is different than AS24 Pro. It is different than Hydro. This one is pretty much going to be a flat support the mid style, but never really rise above the mids. A very clean, a very resolving way to do mids and still have a full sounding mid by just putting enough energy there so they sound full, but not sounding boosted. Again, this is one of these sets that makes a lot of sense to me because I like mid-centric sets, but if you're used to V-style sets, it's going to sound a little bit strange to you. So I stuck with 100, which is right there. and give you a deepish fit to get all the bass. Again, like I said, this shell is kind of big. You put a tip on it, it's a little bit bigger. I had to push them in a little bit more, and that gives you kind of a deeper fit. You get all the bass. Again, this is not a boosted style bass. You don't want to lose any bass from leakage from your tips. You can use the foam tips. You'll get even more bass because that gives you a really nice seal. But it does have linear extension. KZ is really good about having, I think all the AS24 sets all have this kind of linear style bass that actually reaches back. You'll end up with a little bit more impact because they tend to push up the mid bass just a little bit, and the sub bass on a balanced armature bass style is going to roll off. It's not going to be a huge, deep, rumbling sound. It is going to have linear extension, so it will extend into the rumble section, but not necessarily rumble all that hard. So I will say it basically has more impact than deep rumble. And on the mids, unlike previous V-shaped KZ sets, this one is mid-centric. It is a revealing style mid, and it does have forward mids without pushing them forward. Specifically, or the specialty of this style of mid-centric is going to be vocals over complex backgrounds. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what mid-centric really sounds like, they essentially tuck the bass shelf and the treble shelf underneath the mids. So you never really are in a situation on a track where you're hearing really pounding bass above the mids. There is no bass carried over into the mids. There are no cymbal crashes. There are no 5Ks, 8K sibilants, other style upper treble instruments rising above the mids. The mids should really sit almost on a tabletop, and the bass and the treble should sort of be one step below. And that really allows you to have very clear sounding vocals over complex backgrounds, because the background is always going to be slightly lower. And on a balanced armature set, you're essentially going to get this natural separation because the mids are sort of not pushed above, but the bass and the treble are a little bit lower. So you end up with very clear mids, but the bass and the treble being a little bit lower, being executed on balanced armatures where you do have that tech performance capability. You are going to get the speed from balanced armatures. You are going to get all the note definition, all the nice edges, all those things. So even though you are bringing the level down just a little bit here and a little bit here, you know, the technical performance of those is not lost because you do have balanced armatures. And again, I think this style mid-centric set executed on balanced armatures is a little bit unique. It sounds very cool. I mean, the first time I heard it, I do think this is one of KZ's most ambitious tunings because it really demands an end-to-end balance and really tucking in the bass and the treble so they were right under the mids. That isn't something that KZ typically does on their sets, and to hear it executed quite well where there really isn't, and you can say that there's a peak there, but I'll talk about that in a second. But really, this bass shelf is tucked really, really nicely underneath the mids. And the treble, the way this rolls off, like I said, it works really well on Butterfly. It works here as well, but they actually changed the slope of it a little bit. So you are getting kind of this lower extended version of it. So I think Butterfly actually drops off a little bit faster. KZ tends to let it extend out a little bit longer. So you are getting a nice bass shelf over here, and the complement to it is this sort of flatter but longer, more extended treble, and the two kind of balance really, really nicely together. And those, of course, sit right underneath the mids, who are nice and resolving because of everything has been revealed as opposed to being masked by bass or overwritten or overshadowed by too much treble. So, but at the same time, I will say that mid-centric sets with all balanced armatures is very difficult. It's almost too raw. The mids are right there, very revealed. They're almost too transparent. And that sort of leads to this deeper fit at 2.5. So when you see a 2.5 like this, where you have kind of a peak here and then it drops off kind of quickly, if this sounds too peaky, and it actually shouldn't sound too peaky because it's actually underneath the Harman target, but if it does, I would actually push in the shells just a little bit deeper. And you know, lots of sets actually did this. Soft Ears Volume was one that the peak was like way up here. The shape was almost identical to this, but the peak was way up there. And you really had to push those in deep to get past that point of that 2.5 sounding so peaky. Here, you just have to push them in a little bit to get that from sounding peaky, but this should really sound linearly the same from all the way out here through all the way out here. As you raise the volume, there should be no peakiness. If you are hearing peakiness, you've got to change your tips. You've got to push it in a little bit. This should actually sound very mid-centric, very linear, very separated. You shouldn't really have, there should be very clean set linear, not linear, but a very clean delineation between your vocals and your bass and your treble. And if you don't, your fit is probably a little bit off. So I do like it because I recognize that it is a little bit different in tuning. It is a bit special because KZ doesn't do mid-centric sets all that often, and it's really difficult to do. Again, I'd say this tuning, to get this treble level the way they did it, so it never really rides too high. It doesn't impart any kind of BA timbre. It doesn't, have any sibilance and fatigue. Very, very hard to do in such a flat style tuning. So, I do give them a lot of credit for taking a whack at it. I will also admit that this won't be everyone's cup of tea. Some of you will prefer the more V-shaped on AS24. You'll prefer the more V-shaped on Hydro. But for those of you looking for specifically, more mid-centric, more flat style tuning, this one is going to be, something that you would look at. And the treble, the balance is really between enough and not too much. Like I said, Butterfly and Sonata kind of do the same thing. There's just enough treble there to impart the amount of upper range that was really needed to really pull off the tuning, but not too much where it goes off into off natural or sounding fatiguing. You really stay in the zone of adding resolve and dynamics and range, but not going off natural or BA timbre. And again, KZ tends to push that range kind of to the upper boundary of it. Again, like I said, this one carries off just a little bit extra. And that little bit of extra, people may notice, may not notice, but it does give you that balanced armature sense of airiness, and I think they actually did it quite well. And I would say that the point of a 14 balanced armature set like this isn't to roll off a little bit early, isn't to bury it underneath a lot of sub bass. It really should have nice clean extension where you can hear it out to the horizon of your hearing, and that's exactly what KZ did on this particular set. And on the source, the fit, and the tips, I'll actually say it's harder than it appears. Again, like I said, this one, the shell is a little bit bigger. The tips, you do have a choice of the foam and the Starline. When I first got it, I think I actually started with the Starline, and then I actually felt too much pressure building up, and I'm like, this thing sounds really amazing, but I'm getting kind of pressure buildup, and that wasn't all that spectacular to go through. So then I switched to the foam tips. Those will give you a different style sound, but there's no pressure buildup. So I kind of ended up rewriting my notes a few times because I was switching between these style tips, KB07 style tips. So I will say it's a little bit harder than it appears because I ended up rewriting my notes about 3 times based on 3 different style things that I was hearing from the different tips I was getting. So it will vary quite a bit by source and tips. And again, if someone says, I absolutely hate this set because of the pressure buildup, or it sounds super peaky at 2.5, I will sort of get it because of what I went through trying to get it to the point where I enjoyed the sound. And I would say it's no different than what I went through on Eiffels Cantor as well, right? It had a really funky nozzle to it. It required a certain depth and a certain tip that worked well with your ears. This one, I sort of went through the same exact process of finding the tips and the insertion depth that actually made this sound nice and smooth with no peaks and kind of end to end as it should sound. So, yep. So it definitely needs to sound like the graph, like I just said. If it sounds off, too much peakiness at 2.5, if you're getting too much pressure, then yeah, do explore the other tips that are in the box or other tips that you may have on hand. So that is what I got on Sonata. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.